A letter arrives, but with no name, no destination. A mystery is born. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. This community is growing fast. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your voices make this journey unforgettable. Let's dive into the case. The damp morning light crept through the lace curtains of the Quai des Orfèvres apartment, soft and grey as a fogged mirror. Madame Maigret was already at the stove, her movements unhurried, as if the sizzle of butter in the pan could keep the gloom of Paris at bay. Maigret sat at the small table in his shirt sleeves, nursing a bowl of coffee that had gone lukewarm. His heavy face, half hidden by the drifting tendrils of smoke from his pipe, betrayed no urgency, only that peculiar stillness he wore before the day's demands reached him. The telephone hadn't rung all morning, and he didn't expect it to. No summons from the magistrate, no petty robbery reports, no sudden corpses disturbing his peace. Yet in the silence, he felt the faint pressure of something unfinished, like the echo of a cough in another room. It was not a thought, but a sensation, one that had tugged at him since yesterday afternoon when he had returned from the office with more weariness than explanation. Madame Maigret had noticed it, of course, but she had asked nothing. She never asked. She simply set the table with a little more care, her way of acknowledging the things her husband could not yet put into words. He stared at the newspaper folded beside his plate, untouched. The front page blared about politics, but his eyes lingered instead on a smaller column near the bottom. Un homme retrouvé mort dans une pension de famille, rue de Turenne. A man found dead in a modest boarding house. No fanfare, no scandal. The article was barely more than a paragraph, the kind of filler piece that slipped unnoticed between advertisements for soap and cheap rail holidays. No name given, just un homme d'une cinquantaine d'années, discovered in his room with the gas fire turned off and the window open to the rain. It was nothing, officially. Perhaps suicide, perhaps accident. Yet Maigret had cut out the clipping and folded it into his coat pocket before bed, as though the ink might whisper something later if kept close. He did not know why. He only knew the words had clung to him, the way certain faces at a cafe sometimes did, their sadness too plain to ignore. He refilled his pipe, tamping the tobacco with his thumb. The match flared, and the smoke rose thick in the still air. Somewhere outside, a tram clattered past, followed by the slow roll of tires in wet gutters. Life went on as indifferently as ever. And yet, he thought, there was a pension in the Marais where someone had died without a name, and where, if he went, the concierge would have a story, and the lodgers would lower their voices, and perhaps in the corner of a drawer or beneath a pillow there would be a detail that explained the reste. Tu ne manges pas, Jules. Madame Maigret's voice pulled him back. He looked at the plate of eggs cooling on the table and smiled faintly, though without appetite. I'll eat later, he murmured, his deep voice rumbling as if from the bottom of his chest. He reached for his coat hanging on the rack by the door. Heavy wool, worn at the cuffs. The folded clipping rustled in its pocket. He kissed his wife on the cheek, the gesture automatic, reassuring, and stepped into the stairwell. The walls smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and soap. Outside, the rain had resumed, fine and persistent, soaking the cobblestones of the quay. He buttoned his coat, set his hat firmly on his head, and walked with his heavy, deliberate stride toward the bridge, toward the old quarter. It was not duty that drew him, not yet. It was something quieter, more stubborn, the sense that a man who died nameless in a rented room should not be left to vanish between the lines of a newspaper column. Somewhere, in the creak of the pension stairs, or in the silence of a fellow lodger, Maigret expected to find not a crime, perhaps, but a story that mattered, and that was enough for him to begin. The rain had settled into that persistent drizzle that made Paris seem suspended between 1 hour and the next. Maigret crossed the Pont Louis-Philippe, the river gliding with the complacency of a cat that had eaten, and turned into Rue de Touraine, where the shutters were at half-mast and a baker swept damp flour into the gutter. There were umbrellas like black mushrooms and girls with bare hands under shawls, and in the doorway of a cobbler's a lamp burned though it was morning. He walked without hurry, hat-brim dripping, his coat taking on a darker sheen, the cut-out newspaper square like a second skin against the lining. He could have turned back at any corner, and it would not have surprised him. The impulse pulling him forward had nothing of a summons about it. It was more the desire to look once at a room where a man had ceased to be, to see whether the walls remembered him. The pension announced itself without pride, a narrow doorway with yellowed glass, the doorbell a nickel button worn smooth, and a crooked enamel plaque in blue letters, Pension de famille, chambre. Behind the door, a smell of soup that had started too early, boiled linen and stove coal. The kind of smell that clung to people when they went out and made you guess where they lived. He rang and waited. Somewhere a pan clattered and a voice muttered that she was coming. Madame Chevrier, he learned the name later, appeared at the end of the tiled hallway as if pushed by the stove's heat. She was not young, but not old in the way of concierge, who had grown into their keys. She wore a black cardigan buttoned unevenly over a dress the color of dust, and a ring of keys at her belt tapped the enamel tiles as she walked. Her face had that unembarrassed calm of one who had seen all sorts of tenants and all sorts of mornings. She took in the hat, the wet coat, the serious mouth around the pipe. She did not need a card to know who he was. "You're from?" She let the question die half-formed, wary of the name that would fix her day into police and statements and magistrates. "Maigret." He said it like stating the weather. "From the quay." "I read about your lodger in the paper. May I come in out of the rain first?" Her relief at the tone, neither official nor friendly, was visible in the way her shoulder dropped. She opened the glass door wider. The hallway was narrow, lined with hooks, the floor chessboard of black and white squares, rubbed thin by years of shoes. The stove in the little concierge's lodge made a low, sullen sound, and on top of it a pot bubbled, breathing onion and cabbage into the air. A cat lay in the warm dirt of a potted plant that had given up trying to be green. "We telephoned the police last night," she said, handing him a towel she found from somewhere and fussing as if he were one of her tenants. "They came. A young one with a mustache. They took the body away to La Morgue. He is not one of ours, monsieur. He was only here 3 nights, quiet, very polite, paid for a week in advance. Such a thing, you understand. For a little pension, the last was half complaint, half apology, as if she were afraid he might think her establishment accustomed to corpses." Maigret dried the brim of his hat, and did not put it back on. He stood for a moment near the stove, letting the heat soak into his sleeves. He nodded at the pot. "Lunch will be ready early." "It always is. Workman and a student. They go out hungry if I'm not careful. And now, this. The police last night made a mess. They moved everything. Did they tell you he opened the window?" "I read it," said Maigret. He did not take out the clipping. He had no desire to emphasize that he had come on his own. "May I see his room?" She hesitated, out of reflex. Then, as if remembering that the room would be empty long enough anyway, she nodded. 6, on the 2nd floor on the courtyard." She paused. "You will not need. There is no danger of—" She gestured vaguely, as if gas could leak from a memory. "No," he said with a small smile that made his heavy features gentler. "No danger. Before we go, may I glance at your register?" He asked it almost as an afterthought, eyes sliding to the desk in the glassed-in lodge where a big book lay open. She brought the ledger, holding it as carefully as she did the pot's lid. He took it and did not pull the book toward him. He bent to it where it was, the way a doctor leans over a bed. The pages were lined and ruled in fading blue. Occupants scrawled their names in different hands, some with flourishes and some like broken fence posts, fatigue everywhere in the ink. He found the last entry with a finger. Lundi, Monsieur Laurent, âgé 52, sans bagage. Paiement 1, Simenon, adresse B. After the colon, there was a dash, and the smug little blank space that said more than words. It wasn't unheard of. Cheap places did not ask too many questions when they were paid in cash, but the absent address plucked a string in him. It vibrated with something familiar. He lifted his eyes. You asked him? I ask everyone. Some pretend they don't hear. Others give something like Chez ma tante à Montrouge, and I write it. He smiled and said he had no address, that he was in between. He made a joke about being a man without an address. I did not laugh, monsieur. One doesn't joke with registers. A man without an address, Maigret repeated, as if testing the shape of the phrase. It landed softly in the air and sat there like a small bird that had chosen the wrong branch. On the stairs, the carpet runner was faded to threads down the middle. The banister was warm under the hand with the heat of the building, and it had that faint, tacky polish that never seems to be new or clean. A door on the first landing opened with a scrape, and a young man in a stiff collar peered out. He had ink on his fingers and the slight pallor of students who copy all day in offices. He looked at Maigret the way tenants look at uniforms, as if they were all suddenly being weighed. Then he disappeared again, shoes squeaking on the boards. "Clerk," said Madame Chevrier, to fill the silence. "At a notary." He's not one to make noise. And Madame Roussel next door sews. You won't trouble them, monsieur. I don't trouble anyone if I can avoid it, Maigret said, and his heavy step made less sound going up than one would have imagined. Room 6 still smelled faintly of gas, though the tap had been closed. The window, giving onto a narrow courtyard where a scrawny tree attempted a leaf, was open. Rain had pebbled the sill and dampened the frame. The bed was iron, the mattress thin and indented where weight had lain. On the washstand, a cracked porcelain jug held clean water. The police had been tidy in that then, or perhaps the dead man had been. A cheap valise sat under the chair with its mouth closed, leather scuffed white at the corners. On the table, a saucer with the ash from 2 cigarettes, a glass with a faint ring of something sweet. Anisette, perhaps, and beside it, a square of white that did not belong. A thick envelope, sealed, unaddressed. He did not go to the envelope immediately. He stood first near the table, hands deep in the pockets of his coat, looking without looking. The rain was a quiet hiss, like the whisper of the city thinking to itself. Something was wrong here, but he did not yet know whether it was the wrongness of death or the wrongness of living too cautiously. His eyes ticked over small things without stopping. The shoes under the bed set parallel, their soles dusty, not dark with wet. The hat on the peg, brim down, ordinary and clean. The matchbox on the mantel turned so that the little picture of the dancer faced the wall. A handkerchief folded on the chair as if for show. The police last night. They didn't take that. He nudged his chin at the envelope. They asked, said Madame Chevrier, her voice becoming small in the doorway. I told them he had nothing. Only his valise and some shirts. I did not see that then, monsieur. I saw it when I dusted early, only a little dusting, just to put things right. I put it back as I found it. He took a step and looked down at the envelope without touching it. It was not new. The paper had the weight and faint yellow one finds in stationers that sell to offices. The gum of the flap shone a little. No name, no address, not even the flourish of a sender's initials. There is something indecent, he thought, about a sealed envelope that does not say who it is for. It is a confession with its mouth taped shut. May I? He asked, though there was no one to ask. Not the dead. Not the magistrate. He put the back of his fingers to it, like testing again whether the gas was cold, and felt the slight give of papers within. No coins, no heavy corners. He did not open it. He took his pipe out, but did not light it. The silence in the little room pressed against his ribs and found their old shape. He was quiet, said Madame Chevrier, as people say to fill the spaces that death opens. He coughed in the night, but not much. He went out yesterday after the rain stopped at 5. He came back before 9. He took no dinner. He had a glass from the cabinet, he asked if he might, and drank something he bought in a bottle. He said good evening to me like a gentleman. He did not go out again. The shoes under the bed, dusty, said as much. The window? It was open when I came at 9:30, when he did not answer. We are careful with gas here. I smelled nothing at first. Then, it's silly to say the air was wrong, monsieur, but it was wrong air interested him. He knew something about it. He crossed to the washstand and lifted the jug's lid. Clean. The towel was damp, but not wet. Someone had wiped hands that were not clean, or else had only played at cleanliness. He crouched, heavy coat pulling at his shoulders, and slid the valise out. It was light. Inside, 2 shirts folded with the care of men who never learned to fold well. A pair of socks rolled into a ball, a shaving kit with a cheap razor, a small bottle of hair tonic that smelled of those barber shops where politics are cut thinner than hair. No papers, no book, no photograph on the inside pocket flapping down like a moth when you open it. He replaced it all as it had been and straightened, feeling the familiar tug in his knees. He went to the mantel and turned the matchbox so the dancer faced the room again. It made no difference except to his mood, which improved by a hair. He smelled the glass and filed away the sweet note. Not everyone drank anisette when alone, but some did when they felt they should be gentler with themselves. In the doorway, the student clerk hovered, hat in his hands this time, his narrow face made narrower by curiosity. Monsieur, he ventured, as if speaking during a funeral service. I saw him last night, monsieur. In the corridor. He had, if I may say, an envelope. I noticed, because it was very white, people carry envelopes, said Maigret without reproach. Did he say anything? He said, good evening, like Madame told you. He was polite. He had no... You know how sometimes men look as if they are running? He did not. He was like a man who has reached where he was going. And you? Maigret asked, not because it mattered, but because the boy needed to speak. Where were you going? To the water closet. The boy reddened and then smiled at his embarrassment, which made him look younger. I'm sorry. I do not want to cause trouble to Madame. No one wants to cause trouble to Madame, said Maigret, and Madame puffed a prideful breath she tried to hide. He let the silence take back the room. He asked nothing of the seamstress. He did not knock on her door. He had no wish to harvest more scraps than the soup could hold. He looked once more at the envelope and left it where it was. If a policeman comes, he said quietly to Madame as they went back down the stairs, you will say that Inspector Maigret from the quay advised you to leave things as they are for now. If someone asks for the envelope, you will not give it, not even to a magistrate unless I know. She stared at him, then nodded. There was a calculation in her that pleased him. She had weighed his quiet against bureaucracy and found it heavier. In the concierge lodge, she poured thick coffee into a cup, barely clean, and pushed it toward him. He took it, though he did not drink. Through the glass door he could see the courtyard, the scrawny tree bowed with water. He saw the window of room 6, its half-open mouth. He felt all at once the fatigue that Paris gives men who look too hard at its smaller sorrows. Had he visitors? He asked, stirring coffee that did not need stirring. No, she said with too much certainty. Then, feeling his eyes not on her, but on the cat that had emerged to rub against his trouser leg, she corrected herself. No one I saw. The telephone rang once at 7, but it was for the second floor. The boy. The bell on the street door jangled. It was a nervous bell, one that had been pulled too often by people afraid of being late. Madame smoothed her cardigan and went to the door. Maigret remained where he was, cup in hand, smoke unlit. He heard voices, female, pitched low, and the slippered slide of someone wiping shoes that were not wet. Madame brought the visitor to him as if he were a piece of furniture that lent authority to the room. The woman who entered had powdered her face too carefully for mourning. You could still see the strokes where the puffy had passed, and at the jawline the skin was a different shade, the way some people wear a lie that does not fit. She was thin, the kind of thinness that comes from nerves rather than deprivation. Her gloves were new, so were the buckles on her shoes. The soles of those shoes were dry, untouched by the rain that had not stopped since dawn. "I'm looking," she said, and her voice had that controlled sweetness of women who live near Rue Saint-Antoine and know how to speak to tradesmen, "for a friend, a gentleman who may be staying here." She did not look at Maigret, or did so only as one notes a presence that might have to be reckoned with later. "He is tall. He coughs a little. He would be in a room. I do not know the number." Madame's eyes flicked to Maigret, then back to the visitor. "We have many tenants," she said, not unkindly. The woman smiled her little powdery smile. "Of course. This would be silly of me." She turned to go. When her hand touched the door, she paused very slightly. "He might have given no address," she added, as if it were a joke that some men found amusing. "Some men," murmured Maigret for himself, and sipped the coffee he had not wanted, which had gone cold. The woman's perfume was faint and old-fashioned, and it vanished almost as soon as the door closed behind her. Madame stood looking at the empty space where the perfume had been, and the cat, bored by policemen, went back to the warm dirt. "Do you know her?" Maigret asked. Madame shook her head. "She's not one of ours." "Nor was he," said Maigret, putting his hat back on. Outside, the drizzle had grown finer, almost like breath. He stepped into it and stood for a moment under the eaves, pipe clenched between teeth, unlit. He looked up at the second-floor window, at the dark rectangle of a room that had given up its tenant without a protest. Something troubled him, but it was not a question that could be asked. It was more like the knowledge that an envelope without an address sits heavier on a table than one might expect, and that shoes too dry tell as many lies as wet ones. He walked away with the slow, deliberate gait that never hurried and never seemed to arrive, the rain making a collar of his coat. He would not go to the morgue yet. He would let the blank rectangle of paper and the woman with dry shoes sit inside him and shift their weight. When they had settled, they would tell him what he needed to ask and to whom. For now, Paris breathed and steamed, and he breathed with it, and somewhere a cheap window latch rattled as if it had something to say. The drizzle did not lift as the day wore on. Maigret moved through the streets as if the rain were simply part of the air he breathed, his pipe heavy between his teeth, though it was not lit. He had left Rue de Touraine behind. Yet the pension lingered in him, the pale envelope, the careful concierge, the woman powdered too thickly for mourning, and shoes that told more of her than her words. He let these details shift inside him, slow as stones finding their place at the bottom of a river. He did not hurry. A man in his position, after so many years, knew that haste was the surest way to miss what mattered. He walked aimlessly, or appeared to. In truth, he was circling, letting his steps take him past cafes where men smoked and read racing results, past doorways where women leaned on brooms and gossiped in undertones. It was not questions he needed yet, but the feel of the neighborhood, the small texture of its life. If a man had come here with no address, with little more than a valise and a cough, it meant he sought a place unnoticed, a pocket where he might fold himself until he decided to be seen again. Paris was full of such pockets, but each had its own rhythm. Maigret wanted to hear this one. By late morning he had reached the corner of Rue Saint-Gilles and stopped at a café whose windows were clouded with steam. He stepped in, heavy coat dripping, and nodded to the waiter who did not need to ask for his order. The hot white wine came in a thick glass, slightly chipped, and Maigret cupped it in both hands before tasting. Around him, clerks and small shopkeepers took their midday aperitif, voices rising and falling like the tide. No one spoke of a dead man in a pension. News like that slipped quietly beneath notice unless the police or the papers made it large. This one had not. He let the warmth of the wine soften him and listened. Bits of talk reached him, a complaint about rent, a laugh about a girl's hat, a mutter about a cousin's trouble with taxes. Ordinary lives, each with its own small drama. It was against this backdrop that the dead man's silence had to be measured. He finished his glass, paid without fuss, and left, walking with that heavy, deliberate step that made people give way without knowing why. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the office smelled of wet coats and the ink of carbon copies. Young inspectors leaned on desks, smoking and trading fragments of cases. Maigret passed through them like a barge on the river, acknowledged with brief nods. In his own room, the window was blurred with rain and the radiator ticked faintly. He sat, pulled open a drawer, and laid the newspaper clipping flat before him, smoothing it with broad fingers. Then he reached for the telephone. The call to La Morgue was brief. The attendant, bored and nasal, told him the body was still there, tagged, awaiting identification. No one had come forward. Age approximately 52, lungs congested, no marks of violence. Clothes ordinary, grey suit, black tie, worn shoes. Nothing in the pockets but a handkerchief and a packet of Gauloises. The police report filed by the young inspector the previous night said the death was probably accidental. Gas from the stove, the window opened too late, a faint whiff detected when they arrived. Routine, nothing suspicious. The magistrate had not been informed beyond a standard note. Maigret listened without interrupting, then replaced the receiver with a slow motion, as if considering whether to call again. He did not. He leaned back in his chair, pipe in hand, eyes on the rain that blurred the Pont Neuf into a smudge of shadow. The man was dead, that much was certain. But the envelope, the shoes too dry, the visitor with powder and perfume, that was not in the report. He had not mentioned them yet and did not intend to, not until he understood what shape they made together. There was a knock at his door and it opened before he answered. Inspector Lognon stood there, the eternal shadow of gloom on his face. Lognon always looked as though he had been rained on, even when the sun was out, and today, with the drizzle still falling, he seemed nearly drowned. He carried a sheaf of papers, held them out, and said, "Another burglary in Montmartre." Always the same story. No one sees, no one hears, but afterward everyone knows who did it. He gave a shrug that was half despair, half resentment. Maigret took the papers without reading them. "You're wet through, Lognon. Sit down, I haven't the time. They'll say I'm shirking if I stay." He lingered anyway, eyes flicking to the clipping on the desk. "What's that?" "Something from the paper." "A lodger dead in a boarding house. Gas?" Lognon asked with a curl of the lip. "Then it's finished." "Nothing to do with us." "Perhaps," said Maigret. His tone was mild, but Lognon shifted, uneasy. There was something in Maigret's silences that could make another man doubt his own certainties. "Well," Lognon said finally, "you'll find mysteries even in a glass of beer if you look too long." He left, dripping on the tiles, and Maigret returned his gaze to the window. At 3 in the afternoon he put on his coat again and walked to La Morgue. The river smell was sharp, carrying rot and rain together. Inside the air was colder than outside, heavy with disinfectant. The attendant led him down the tiled corridor without speaking, as if words did not belong there. The body lay on a slab, covered to the chest with a sheet. Maigret looked down at the face. It was unremarkable. The kind of face one forgets at once unless there is some quirk. A slightly flattened nose, a jaw that sagged with lost teeth, a shadow of beard not shaved the day before. The eyes were closed, and there was a kind of dignity in the stillness, as though death had lent him what life had not. He studied the hands. They were clean but not manicured, with the faint callus of someone who had worked with tools at some time, though not recently. The nails were neatly cut. On the left wrist there was a pale band where a watch had once been, though no watch had been found. He asked the attendant. The man shrugged. If there was, it was gone when he came to us. No papers, no identification, just a man without an address, without a name, without a watch. Maigret felt a heaviness that had nothing to do with the damp air. He lit his pipe then, though smoking was not permitted, and no one stopped him. The smoke curled, heavy and blue over the tiled walls. He stood a long time as though the man might eventually stir and tell him his story. But the body remained mute. Leaving the morgue, he walked back through the streets without direction until evening drew its curtain over the city. Lamps flickered on in rows, and rain turned them into halos. He found himself once more near Rue de Touraine. Hunger tugged at him, not sharp but persistent. He entered a small bistro with steamed windows and the smell of beef simmering with carrots. The room was nearly empty, just 2 workmen at one table and a woman eating alone at another, her umbrella propped against the wall. Maigret ordered stew and a glass of red wine. He ate slowly, eyes drifting to the woman. She was thin, not the powdered visitor of the morning, but someone plainer, in a wool coat patched at the elbows. She had a face worn by years of work. Yet there was something attentive in the way she ate, as if she were waiting. Once, her eyes lifted and met his. They did not drop at once. They held his gaze, then looked away with a small nod, like an acknowledgement of something shared. He wondered if she too lived at the pension or knew of it. He made no move, asked no question. He preferred to wait. When he had finished, he paid and stepped back into the drizzle. He lit his pipe and walked once more to the pension, not to enter but to stand across the street, watching. Light burned in the window of room 6. Someone had gone in. It could be Madame Chevrier tidying. It could be the student. It could be the powdered woman returned. He watched the shadow move against the curtain, heavy and indistinct. Then the light went out. He stood for a time longer, rain soaking the brim of his hat, before turning back toward the river. The city murmured around him, indifferent, yet he felt that inside that pension's walls a story was pressing to the surface, held back by silence, by fear, by the simple stubbornness of ordinary people who had too much to lose by speaking. He would wait. He would return. The envelope without an address was not finished with him yet, nor he with it. And so, under the steady drizzle of Paris, Maigret walked on, the smoke of his pipe blending with the mist, his heavy step sounding like the city's own heartbeat. The night had settled over Paris like a damp cloak, muffling the streets and softening the glow of the lamps, so they seemed to float above the cobbles. Maigret walked back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, not with haste, but with that same heavy stride that made him seem a part of the pavement itself. The shadow he had seen in the window of room 6 lingered in his mind, though he told himself it could have been nothing more than Madame Chevrier adjusting the curtains. Still, the image remained, a figure behind thin fabric, extinguished in an instant. It was the kind of detail he did not note on paper, but carried inside, where it weighed and shifted until it revealed something. At the office, the lamps were still lit. Young inspectors hunched over desks with the weary determination of men waiting for an hour when they could leave without reproach. The telephone rang somewhere, a sharp metallic note against the dull hum of the room. Maigret removed his coat, shook off the rain, and sat. He did not light the lamp on his desk. He preferred the half-dark. He filled his pipe carefully, tamping the tobacco as if pressing down thoughts that threatened to rise too quickly. He did not open a file. There was none. The case, officially, was closed as soon as it had been noted. But in Maigret's mind it was already open, not because of evidence, but because of atmosphere. The faint smell of gas that had not been strong enough, the envelope sealed and nameless, the woman with dry shoes who had arrived too deliberately. Such things do not align by chance. He sat in the dim light until the sound of the Seine beyond the window seemed louder than the scratching pens, and only then did he rise and go home. Madame Maigret was waiting as she always did, with the calm patience of someone who had long accepted the rhythms of her husband's work. Supper was simple: boiled potatoes, a slice of ham, a salad dressed with mustard. She asked nothing, only served him, and spoke lightly of the neighbor who had brought a new canary, of the grocer's boy who had dropped a basket of apples in the street. He ate slowly, smoking between bites, listening more to her voice than her words. It steadied him. When at last he set down his knife and fork, she looked at him as if to say, "Now you may go on thinking again." He rose, kissed her forehead, and sat in his armchair with a glass of beer. The evening passed in silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of her sewing and the long sigh of his pipe. Yet his mind was not still. It turned over the image of the woman who had come to the pension and spoken of a friend, careful to describe him in terms vague enough to fit anyone but precise enough to fit only him. She had asked as though rehearsed, and her shoes had betrayed her. Powder and perfume in the morning meant anticipation, not chance. She had known she would be seen. Sleep came late, and it was light. At dawn he was already awake, lying in bed with his great frame turned toward the window where the pale light pressed against the curtains. Madame Maigret stirred, looked at him, and said only, "It is not finished, is it?" He grunted, which in his language meant no, and rose. The rain had eased by morning, leaving the streets slick and shining, reflecting the shutters and awnings like a mirror. He returned to Rue de Turenne. This time he entered the pension without ringing, as though he belonged. Madame Chevrier looked up from her stove, unsurprised, and gestured toward the coffee pot. He accepted. She had already placed bread on the table. There was a quiet understanding between them now. She knew he would come back until the thing inside the walls gave up its silence. As he drank, the student from the second floor descended the stairs, pale and carrying his satchel. He hesitated at the sight of Maigret, then offered a stiff little bow. "Good morning, monsieur." His voice cracked slightly. "Going to work?" Maigret asked, without looking up from his coffee. "Yes, at the notary's." The boy lingered, then blurted, "Madame Roussel, she says she heard voices last night." "In the corridor, after you had gone." He flushed as though speaking might get him into trouble. Maigret set down his cup. "Whose voices?" She said a man and a woman. She thought the man was the one who? He faltered. "But that cannot be, of course." "Of course," said Maigret, rising. He did not press the boy further. He simply nodded and began to climb the stairs again, his steps slow, deliberate. At the landing he paused, listening. The building was quiet except for the creak of wood as it settled. He opened the door to room 6. It was as he had left it, except the envelope was gone. The table was bare, save for the ashtray and glass. He stood very still, pipe unlit, his eyes moving slowly over every surface. The bed, the chair, the washstand. They told him nothing new, but the absence of the envelope told him much. Someone had returned in the night, someone who knew enough to take only that. He closed the door gently and went back down. Madame Chevrier was watching him, her hands busy with the pot, though her eyes betrayed curiosity. "Someone has been in that room," he said. "I lock the doors," she protested. "Always. Only I and the maid have keys." "Perhaps," Maigret murmured. He did not accuse. He simply noted the nervousness in her hands. Then he asked, "And the woman who came yesterday? Did she return?" "No," said Madame firmly. But the way she said it suggested she wished it were true more than she knew it was. He left her with her stove and walked back into the street. The drizzle had not returned. Instead, the air hung heavy, expectant. He lit his pipe at last, drew deeply, and exhaled smoke that drifted like thought. The envelope was gone, but its absence was louder than its presence. Someone had risked returning, had entered a house where death had recently been, had stolen from a room still thick with suspicion. That meant urgency. It meant fear. The day stretched out before him, and when he allowed it to, he walked toward the Marais, past the shops that were opening their shutters, past the smell of fresh bread and damp wool. He stopped at a cafe on a corner, ordered coffee, and spread the morning paper. There was no mention of the dead man. Instead, politics, scandals, a bank robbery across the river. He folded the paper and sat, smoking. Eventually, he telephoned the Quai, asked for a list of recent complaints involving missing persons, men in their 50s, unaccounted for in the last week. He gave no explanation, only asked that the file be prepared for him by afternoon. When he returned to his office, the young inspector with the mustache, the same who had filed the report, was waiting. He stood stiffly, file in hand. "I was at Rue de Turenne last night, Chief." The report was filed. Accidental death. Gas. Nothing more to do. "Nothing more," Maigret repeated, his tone dry. He gestured to the chair. "And yet you are here." The young man flushed. "I thought perhaps... Well, there was a woman. She came after I had finished. She asked questions about the man. I told her nothing, of course. What did she look like? Tall, thin, too much powder, gloves. She said she was a friend. I believed she was lying." Maigret's pipe smoke hung between them. "Did you follow her?" "No, Chief." The young inspector looked ashamed. "Next time, follow," Maigret said mildly, and dismissed him with a wave. He sat long after the young man had gone, staring at the smoke. The woman with dry shoes, the envelope now vanished, the shadow in the window. These threads were tightening, not yet into a noose, but into a shape he recognized. A man without an address had died quietly in a pension. Someone had left him that way, but someone else, or perhaps the same, had been too eager to erase what little he left behind. It was not a grand mystery. It would end, he knew, in something simple. Money, perhaps, or pride, or the desperation of a love unreturned. But before it ended, he would need to wait, to watch, and to let those involved reveal themselves. That was how it always was. He did not catch them. They caught themselves, and so Maigret leaned back in his chair, smoke curling around him like a second fog, while outside the rain returned, tapping at the windows as if impatient to wash away the last traces of a man who had tried to live without an address. The rain returned in earnest that afternoon, a steady curtain that blurred the outlines of the city and made even familiar streets look uncertain. Maigret stayed in his office longer than usual, though his work was not the kind that could be measured in reports or signatures. Files lay unopened on his desk. Instead, he smoked, filling the room with a thick haze, and let his thoughts turn over slowly, one detail pressing against another. The envelope was gone, taken by someone who had known exactly what to look for. The powdered woman had appeared too soon after the death to be innocent curiosity, and the man himself, dead without papers, without an address, without even a watch on his wrist, had seemed to erase himself before anyone else had the chance. In the late afternoon, the list of missing persons was delivered. Maigret thanked the clerk with a nod and began leafing through the sheets. Most were the usual: young men who had quarreled with parents and vanished to the Iada south, old men who wandered from hospitals, deserters from small marriages who would reappear in a week with another woman. But there were two entries that caught him. One was a commercial traveler from Rouen, 51, who had not returned from a trip to Paris 3 days earlier. The other was a clerk from a bank in Montreuil, said to be 53, absent without explanation since Monday. Both had been reported by relatives. Neither quite matched the man at the morgue, though they were close enough to remain in his mind. He slipped the sheets into a folder, locked the drawer, and put on his coat. The drizzle was still falling, fine but steady, and he let it soak into his hat as he walked again toward Rue de Touraine. He had no intention of entering the pension this time. He wanted only to see it from the outside, to watch who came and went. He found a small café across the street and sat near the window, ordering a glass of beer. The window pane was streaked with rain, distorting his view, but he preferred it that way. The pension stood as before, unremarkable, its enamel plaque dull under the grey light. People passed, an old woman with groceries, a pair of children in wooden clogs, a postman with his cap pulled low. For a long time nothing else stirred. Then, near dusk, the door opened and a woman stepped out. It was not Madame Chevrier, nor the seamstress, nor the student. It was the powdered woman. She carried herself with the same composed haste, her gloves precise, her step firm on the wet stones. She paused for a second to look up and down the street, then walked toward the boulevard. She did not notice Maigret in the café. He watched her until she disappeared among the umbrellas and traffic. He did not follow. He simply finished his beer, paid, and returned to the quay. There he wrote a brief note to an inspector in plain clothes, giving a description and asking that the woman be quietly followed if she appeared again at Rue de Touraine or nearby. He did not explain further. He knew better than to press too soon. That evening he dined at home with Madame Maigret, who served a pot-au-feu fragrant with marrow bones and leeks. He ate steadily, and she, watching him, asked only once, "It troubles you still?" He nodded, not with impatience but with gravity. "It is not finished," he said, and returned to his plate. Later, when the house was quiet, he sat again in his armchair, pipe in hand, beer within reach. The sounds of the street floated up faintly. Voices, a cartwheel, the patter of rain. He thought of the man's hands, clean but marked with old calluses. A worker once, perhaps, turned clerk. A man who had folded his life down into a valise and carried it to a boarding house, and an envelope, sealed, without name, left like a secret too heavy to speak. Someone had risked much to take it. Secrets worth such risk were rarely about politics or crime. They were usually smaller but more human. An affair, a debt, a quarrel made, dangerous by pride. The next morning he was back at the pension. Madame Chevrier looked weary but not surprised. She had brewed coffee, which she poured for him as though he were a boarder. "There was another," she said before he could ask. "Another woman. Not the same one." She came after supper, asked about the gentleman. She did not come in. She asked from the door. Maigret stirred his coffee. What did she look like? Plainer, dark coat, no powder, no perfume. Older. She asked if he had left a letter. I told her no. She went away at once. "And you?" he asked. She hesitated, then met his eyes. "I said nothing more as you asked. But the tenants, they notice. They whisper. They think there was something there was," Maigret said simply. He set down the cup and climbed the stairs once more. Room 6 was still empty, the air lifeless. He stood in it for a long time, as if the silence itself might confess. He looked again at the shoes under the bed, neat and dry. He thought of the watch missing from the wrist, of the envelope gone in the night, of the two women, one powdered, one plain, asking about a man who had come with no address. He thought of Madame Roussel hearing voices in the corridor after his first visit. Back downstairs, he asked to see the register again. He studied the entries, page after page of names. Students, clerks, widows, petty merchants. And then, 3 days earlier, the one that stood apart, Monsieur Laurent, 52, without address. He stared at the word Laurent. It might be true, or it might be the simplest lie a man could choose. It was a name that could belong to anyone, yet belonged to no one. He closed the book and left the pension. Outside, the air was heavier, clouds pressing low. He walked without aim until he found himself at the small bistro where he had eaten stew before. He entered, sat at the same table, ordered wine. The woman who had been there the night before was not present. The place was emptier, the silence of rain-soaked afternoons hanging in it. He smoked, drank slowly, and waited, though he knew not for what. When he returned to the quay, the inspector he had instructed was waiting. "We saw her," the man said. "The woman with powder. She went to Rue de Rivoli, entered a shop, hats and gloves, spoke with the proprietress, then left in a taxi. We followed. She went to a building near Place des Vosges, apartment house. We do not know which floor." Maigret nodded. "Watch her." Quietly. No questions. He dismissed the man and sat again at his desk. He felt the shape of the thing more clearly now, though it was not yet sharp. A man without an address. An envelope no one must see. 2 women seeking him after his death. A missing watch. He had no proof, no facts, but the air around it was wrong, and he trusted that more than any report. That night, back in his apartment, he said little. Madame Maigret did not press. As he smoked in silence, he heard the rain on the window and thought of the shadow that had crossed the curtain of room 6. Whoever had moved there was not finished, any more than he was. It was a matter of time, and Maigret, more than anyone, knew how to wait. The city outside breathed, restless and indifferent, but within its rain-soaked streets, a small, stubborn story was pressing upward, and Maigret knew it would not remain hidden much longer. The following morning, Paris seemed suspended in a kind of pale stillness, the streets rinsed clean by the night's rain, the air damp and faintly metallic. Maigret rose early, his heavy frame reluctant to leave the warmth of bed, but urged on by something deeper than habit. He moved through breakfast with his wife in silence, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly, buttering bread he did not eat. Madame Maigret, as always, noticed but asked nothing. When he finally reached for his coat and kissed her cheek, she gave him a small, knowing smile, the kind that said she had long ago made peace with the fact that her husband's thoughts did not always belong to their apartment. He walked along the river toward the quay, pipe clenched but unlit, letting the rhythm of his steps untangle the fragments that had lodged in his mind. The man without an address, the envelope that had vanished, 2 women, one powdered and deliberate, the other plain and quick to disappear, the missing watch, and the whisper of voices in the corridor after the death. None of it amounted to evidence, yet it all hummed with the weight of truth waiting to be uncovered. At his office, the inspector he had set to observe the powdered woman had left a note. She had gone again to the shop on Rue de Rivoli, stayed only a few minutes, then returned to the same building near Place des Vosges. No visitors had been seen entering after her. The report was neat, clinical, but it gave Maigret the faint satisfaction of seeing a thread stretched taut. People who move so carefully usually have little practice at it. Sooner or later, something frays. He lit his pipe at last, filled the room with smoke, and then did what he often did when a case hovered just beyond reach. He left it. He walked out into the streets and allowed himself to drift, letting the city breathe around him. He stopped at a newspaper kiosk, bought the day's edition, and glanced at the headlines. Nothing about the dead man. Nothing to connect him to the world beyond Rue de Turenne. The world was content to forget him. Only Maigret was not. Toward midday, he returned to the pension. The street was busier now, carts rattling past, women with baskets pausing to gossip. The enamel sign still leaned crooked on its screws, the glass door streaked with yesterday's rain. He entered without ringing. Madame Chevrier greeted him with a weary nod, her hands red from scrubbing. She had the look of someone carrying too many secrets for the size of her shoulders. "There was trouble again in the night," she said before he spoke. "What kind of trouble?" She lowered her voice, though no one was near. "The student, Monsieur Bernard. He swore he heard footsteps in the corridor at 2 o'clock. He says the door of room 6 opened and closed, but when he looked, nothing. This morning he came to me pale as chalk. He wants to leave. He says the house is unlucky now. Maigret grunted, his gaze drifting to the stairs. Where is he? In his room, packing. Without waiting, Maigret ascended. The landing smelled of dust and damp fabric. He knocked once, then opened the door. The student was indeed packing, shoving books into a satchel, hands trembling. He looked up, startled. Monsieur Inspector, you're leaving? Yes, I cannot sleep here. Since the death, he trailed off, eyes darting nervously to the corridor. You heard something? The boy nodded quickly. Yes, steps. And the door. I am sure. But when I looked, the corridor was empty. The door was closed. Perhaps I dreamed. But I was awake. Maigret studied him, his broad face unreadable. Did you hear voices, as Madame Roussel claimed? No, only the steps. Slow, heavy like yours. Monsieur. The boy flushed, ashamed of the comparison. Maigret's pipe remained unlit in his hand, his thumb pressing against the bowl. Did you ever see the man alive? Speak to him? Only once, in the corridor. He was polite. He coughed. He carried nothing but that envelope. Envelope? Yes, white, thick. I noticed because he held it carefully, with both hands, as if it were important. The boy bent again to his satchel, as though to escape further questions. Maigret left him to his nervous packing. Back on the ground floor, he found Madame Chevrier waiting, her eyes searching his. He said nothing, only lit his pipe at last and stood by the stove, the smoke curling into the smell of cabbage. She wanted to speak but did not, and he respected her silence. When he stepped outside again, the rain had begun once more, a fine mist that blurred the outlines of the opposite buildings. He walked slowly, turning over the new detail. The envelope had been seen in the man's hands. He had brought it with him, perhaps carried it always. It had not been an afterthought left in the room, but something essential, something that had accompanied him to his last days, and someone, after his death, had risked much to take it. He returned to the quay, where another note awaited him. The powdered woman had again been seen leaving the building near Place des Vosges, this time accompanied by a man in a dark coat. They had walked together only a short distance before parting. The man had not been followed. Too crowded, too quick. But the inspector described him middle-aged, stocky, a limp in the left leg. Maigret read the description twice, then leaned back, smoke drifting from his lips. The shape of the story was growing clearer, not yet solid, but he could almost feel the walls of it pressing in. That evening he did not go home directly. Instead he walked again to Rue de Touraine and stood across from the pension. The windows glowed faintly, and behind one he thought he saw Madame Roussel bending over her sewing. Nothing else stirred. He stood in the drizzle until the cold crept into his bones, then turned away. At the corner he stopped at a small cafe and took a table near the stove. He ordered stew and a glass of wine, ate slowly, and watched the door. Halfway through his meal, the plain woman entered, the one Madame Chevrier had described. Dark coat, no powder, face sharp with nerves. She glanced around the room, saw him, and froze. For a moment she seemed ready to leave, but then she gathered herself and took a table at the far end. She ordered nothing, only sat, gloved hands folded tightly on the wood. Maigret did not move toward her. He finished his stew, drained his glass, lit his pipe. When he finally stood to leave, he paused by her table. "Good evening, madam," he said softly. She started, then met his gaze with defiance. "I don't know you." "You know me well enough," he replied. "You're looking for the man from room 6. Her lips pressed together. She said nothing. "You came to the pension asking for a letter." "There was no letter. only an envelope. You know that, don't you? Her eyes flickered, just for an instant, then hardened again. She rose abruptly, brushing past him, and left without a word. Maigret did not follow. He returned to his table, paid, and stepped back into the mist. He knew she would return as surely as the powdered woman would. People bound to a secret always circled back to it, unable to let it lie. His task was only to wait long enough, to watch carefully enough, until the truth revealed itself in the cracks of their silence. He walked home slowly, the drizzle gathering on his coat, his pipe smoke mingling with the damp air. Madame Maigret had kept his supper warm, though he was not hungry. He sat in his armchair, staring at the patterns of rain on the window, and thought again of the man's empty wrist, the missing watch. A man carries a watch as he carries his name. To die without either was not accident. It was erasure, and Maigret, patient as the rain itself, would not let the erasure stand. Morning laid a dull light over the river, pewter on pewter, and the street noises arrived hushed as if Paris was speaking from behind a scarf. Maigret ate a crust of bread without tasting it and watched Madame Maigret cut a sprig of parsley into a bowl as though the small green flecks might cheer the kitchen. She glanced up once, the way one glances at a clock that has no numbers. An envelope with no address, she said, not looking at him. That's not for the post. That's a thing one puts into a person's hand. She went on cutting. And powder in the morning, that is not for errands. That is for courage. He didn't answer. The remark sat down inside him as if it had been waiting for a chair. He put on his coat, kissed her cheek, and went out into a city that had wrung its rain into the gutters and now steamed faintly under a hesitant sun. He did not go first to the quay. He walked toward Rue de Rivoli with the pipe in his pocket and his hands deep in his sleeves. The hat and glove shop was one of those tidy places that smell of cardboard and starch, where ladies' hands are measured in numbers that sound like secrets. A bell jingled. The proprietress appeared from behind a curtain, small and sharp as a new pair of scissors. She looked at his face, then at the hat, then at the coat, and made the quick calculation all shopkeepers make when a man like him enters. "For my wife," he said, his voice gentle, and he lifted his own thick hand as if it were delicate. She has small hands. I never remember the size. Something practical. She burns her fingers on pans, the woman's mouth softened by a millimeter. She produced gloves of brown kid, tried to imagine them on a different life. 6 1/4, perhaps, she said. Your wife keeps house. She does, he said, and let silence sit between them as if they were two old women in a pew. A client of yours, he added after a while, came yesterday. Tall, powdered too carefully. New gloves. She asked for... He gestured toward the shelves as if all the answers lay folded there. A pair of grey, the proprietress said, guarded but not closed. Pearl grey. For bad weather, she has a long hand. 6 3/4. The nails are bitten, but she hides it well. A pause. She liked saying what could not be argued with. She asked for a veil. Not mourning, something to blur. I told her a veil blurs the one who wears it more than the one who sees her. Did she agree? She bought nothing of that kind, the woman said, pride pricking her voice. I do not sell cowardice. Her eyes flicked to him and away. She paid cash and left in a taxi. The driver knows where she went. I do not keep addresses. Of course not, Maigret said, and laid coins on the counter for a pair of gloves he would bring home just to see his wife smile. At the door he turned. She comes often. Twice a year, always alone. She smells of an apartment where windows are not opened. Place des Vosges was a square that pretended nothing ever happened. The plane trees were still damp, and a dog nosed along a bench as if reading yesterday's news. He found the building the inspector had noted. The concierge's lodge was a glass aquarium of ferns and string, and the concierge herself had the face of a woman who knew where the dust lived. He showed his card as one shows a spoon at a child. It calms and explains nothing. "I won't trouble her," he said before the objections gathered. "I dislike troubling people in the morning." He put his hat on the counter. It left a small wet circle. "Madame does not receive," said the concierge out of habit. "No one does really," he said, "but everyone opens the door eventually." He let the quiet do the work. "She lives alone?" The woman pursed her lips. "Third floor, left, a little maid in the afternoons. No husband. A friend now and then, limping. He smells of engine oil. He leaves his hat on the wrong peg." She blinked at her own precision and stiffened as if the words had escaped against regulation. "You won't?" "I won't," said Maigret. "What name shall I write so the postman may pretend he knows it?" "Madame Lachaume," she said, after a pause that told him the name was a sort of bandage rather than skin. "But when letters come, the handwriting is hers. She sends them to herself sometimes." To look busy, he did not go up. He sat instead on the bench under the arch, as men sit when they have nowhere to be and all the time in the world to be there. A workman crossed the square, his left leg swinging a fraction later than the right. The limp was slight but true. He did not enter the building. He passed it, looked at the door without looking, and continued toward the boulevard. Maigret did not follow. He watched the square until the pigeons grew bored with him, then rose and walked back to the Marais, where the streets know how to keep other people's business. A pawn shop near Rue du Pas de la Mule had a window full of watches with white tags like small hospital labels. He went in. The air smelled of iron and regret. Behind the counter, the man had the eyes of someone who lends only to time. "I've mislaid a watch," Maigret said, "and I'm looking for it." He described nothing. The pawnbroker smiled without using his face. "All watches are the same once they're here," the man said. "They tick alike." "They don't," said Maigret mildly, "but you're right to say so." He looked along the tray of men's watches without touching. Cheap nickel, plated brass, a few that had once been gifts. He knew better than to hunt a needle in a room full of needles. He thanked the man and left, carrying with him only the smell of old time. Back at the quay, the inspector's new note waited. The powdered woman had not left her building that afternoon. A man with a limp had been seen waiting opposite, then gone. Nothing more. He read it like a message from a nervous relative. He folded it once and put it away. He went again to Rue de Turenne. The pension had filled itself with the small clatter of midday, plates, a voice scolding a pan, the running water that never quite runs clear. Madame Chevrier glanced up and down the hallway as if news might be hiding under the stair. "She was here," she whispered, before he asked. "The powdered one." "Not long." She said she had left her glove. I told her I found nothing. She did not believe me. She smiled. "Where did she go?" he asked. "To the second floor. She came down at once. She had found nothing. But I saw the pocket of her coat. It was flatter coming down." He stood still, feeling the building breathe around him. "And your maid?" "Leah," she said, and made a face that meant girls were a kind of weather. "She's late again. She says her mother is ill. She says a great many things." He climbed slowly to room 6. The door was locked. He looked at the lock and saw, as one sees a scar on a familiar face, a faint bright crescent around the keyhole where a key not quite right had slipped once, twice. He put a finger to it. Metal remembers. On the floor near the skirting board, a sliver of white lay caught in the crack, no bigger than a fingernail. He crouched with the old care of his knees and teased it out with the blade of his pocket knife. It was the gum from an envelope flap, torn when someone opened it too soon or too late. He held it up to the light, as men do with gratitude, then slid it into his wallet without ceremony. On the landing, the seamstress's door stood ajar. He saw the curve of her back bent over cloth, the needle flashing in and out like a fish. Madame Roussel, he said from the hall, not entering. "You hear more than others." "It is not a fault," she sighed, without turning. "It is a habit," she said. "Habits keep women alive." The needle flashed. "Last night there were steps." "Not at 2. Later. 3. A door. A whisper. The smell of a man who smokes black tobacco and puts too much on his hair." The needle hesitated. "And a woman who doesn't know how to cry quietly." "Which woman?" he asked, though he knew the answer would be a shrug. "The sort who carries new gloves," she said. And the needle began again. In the lodge, Madame Chevrier had finally let her face say what her mouth would not. "It is bad for the house," she murmured, twisting a dish towel. "People think it is a place where things come to an end." "Everything is a place where things come to an end," Maigret said, not unkindly. "And then to a beginning." He poured himself the thick coffee without asking and drank it hot. When he stepped outside, the light had thinned. The day had become one of those Paris afternoons that never quite decide to be evening. He walked toward Place des Vosges again, not because he expected movement, but because waiting is sometimes best done at the place where the thread is tied. The concierge saw him and did not object. He took the same bench, lit his pipe, and let the smoke climb into the colonnade. After a time, the door opened, and the powdered woman came out. In daylight, she seemed less like a figure and more like a person, which did not make her less guarded. She wore the pearl gloves. The veil she had not bought flickered in her glance anyway. She saw him and did not flinch. She hesitated, as if checking for a watch she had not put on, then came toward him as if he were an appointment she had decided to keep. "Madame Lachaume," he said with the faintest smile. He had chosen the bandage rather than the skin. She lowered herself onto the far edge of his bench as if it might be wet. "Inspector," she said. The word came out smooth and chalky. "You have been watching a private person." "I watch air," he said, "and old locks." He tapped Ash with a great thumb. "You went back for a glove." She looked at his pipe smoke as if it might carry away her answer. "Gloves are expensive." "So are secrets," he said. "More expensive than watches sometimes." Her lips pressed together, and in that small pressure he heard his wife's remark again. "Powder for courage." The woman's hands lay motionless on her lap. The new kid creaked once, almost apologetically. "I don't know the man," she said at last, very softly, as if speaking in a church for the benefit of a God who would not believe her anyway. "I have never known him. I read nothing about him in the papers." "I didn't ask you," said Maigret. "You brought him with you." Her eyes flicked to him then, quick and sharp like a needle. For a moment, the powder seemed to lift and show the skin beneath. A woman who had slept badly and chosen a face in the mirror that did not fit. "There are 2 of you," he went on, the words heavy and patient. "One who asks for a letter that was never written. Another who goes for a glove she never lost. Between you there is a man who walked with a limp. Between all of you there is a paper that would not go through the post." She did not answer. But her breath came unsteadily, as though stairs had been climbed. Across the square a child dropped a hoop. It rattled along the stones and fell with the sound of a small truth. The woman put a hand to her throat. Not as actresses do, but as someone does when a collar is too tight. "When you are ready," Maigret said, rising with the effort of a man who does not like to get up for nothing, "you will come where there is coffee and a stove, and you will say what you can. I will be there. If you do not come, others will. People always come. They come to be believed, even when they are lying." He put on his hat. She looked at his great back as if it were a door she had no key for, then looked away at nothing at all. He did not turn. He walked as far as the corner, then paused under the arch. The workman with the limp was there, across the square, watching the watching. Their eyes did not meet. It was not necessary. Between them lay the soft scrape of a key that did not quite fit, and the taste of anise on a glass in a quiet room. By the time Maigret reached the quay, dusk had flattened the river into a dark ribbon. He sat at his desk without lighting the lamp. In the wallet, the torn gum from the envelope lay like a small, dirty tooth. He weighed it with a fingertip. A woman who powders in the morning, a man who smells of oil, a girl who is late, a lock that has learned a new key. The pieces lay where they had fallen, and they had begun to touch. He did not smile. He only sat in the half-dark, the window a grey square, and waited for the small human thing, always the small thing, to give way. The following morning brought no sun, only a dull, even greyness that pressed against the windows of the quay as if Paris had been wrapped in wet wool. Maigret arrived earlier than usual, his coat still damp from the walk, and lowered himself heavily into his chair. He filled his pipe, lit it, and let the room thicken with smoke before he touched the papers waiting on his desk. They were not reports he had asked for, merely the daily debris of the office. He pushed them aside. What occupied him lay elsewhere. The powdered woman on the bench at Place des Vosges, her gloved hands folded too tightly, her breath coming too quick. The sliver of envelope gum teased from the crack of the pension's floor. The man with the limp watching from across the square, silent and certain. He sat until the smoke stung his eyes, then rose and walked again toward Rue de Turenne. The drizzle had returned, fine and persistent, slicking the cobbles until they reflected every lamp and awning. At the pension, Madame Chevrier was at her stove as always, stirring a pot that smelled of onions and bone. She glanced up at him with weary eyes, her mouth pressing into a line as if to say again. "Has anyone been here this morning?" he asked, standing by the stove with his hat still on, the pipe stem clenched between his teeth. She hesitated, then nodded. The maid, Leah. She came early, too early, said she wanted to clean room 6. I told her it was not her place, that you had said nothing was to be touched. She sulked, but she went up anyway. I followed. The door was locked. She had a key. Not mine. Where did she get it? She would not say. She only laughed. Where is she now? Gone. She said she had errands for her mother. She left with her bag. Maigret tamped his pipe with his thumb, eyes narrowing. A girl with a key she should not have. A girl always late, who smelled faintly of perfume not her own. A girl who might be link, messenger, or simply someone foolish enough to be used. He climbed the stairs once more, the banister warm under his hand. The door to room 6 bore the same faint bright scar around the keyhole, and this time the lock yielded easily to Madame Chevrier's key. Inside, the air was the same stale mix of gas and damp fabric, but the bed had been disturbed, not remade, not smoothed, but touched. The valise under the chair was half open, shirts rifled. On the table, the ashtray had been emptied, wiped clean. Even the glass was gone. He stood in the center of the room, breathing smoke, and let the silence speak. Someone had come looking for what he had already noticed. Someone was afraid he might see too much in an empty glass, a handful of ash. He bent, slid the valise out again. The shaving kit was there, the cheap razor, the bottle of tonic. But one shirt was missing, a plain one, collar frayed. He replaced it all carefully, closed the bag, and locked the door behind him. On the landing, Madame Roussel's door creaked open. She peered out, needle still in her hand, thread dangling. "They're frightened now," she said quietly. "Last night again. Voices. The girl's and a man's. Angry. I heard a slap, then the door. She ran down the stairs. The man stayed. I smelled his tobacco." "You see a great deal," Maigret said, not reproachful. "I hear," she corrected. "When one sows, one hears." She withdrew, shutting the door softly. Back in the lodge, he poured coffee without asking. Madame Chevrier watched him, twisting her towel. "It will bring trouble, monsieur." Already the tenants want to leave. The boy packed. Now the girl. This is not a house for secrets. All houses are houses for secrets, he murmured. He drank, set the cup down, and left. The rain had eased to a fine mist. He walked toward Place des Vosges, where the square lay hushed beneath the dripping trees. He did not sit this time. He stood under the arch, pipe smoke curling, and watched the doorway. After a time, the man with the limp appeared, emerging from a cafe across the square. He carried no umbrella, only a newspaper rolled tight in his hand. He glanced once at the building, once at the arch where Maigret stood, then turned away, walking with the steady, uneven rhythm of his gait. Maigret did not follow. He returned instead to the quay, where he summoned the young inspector with the moustache. He gave a description of the girl, Leah, the maid. "Find her," quietly. "Speak to her mother if she has one. Do not frighten her. Bring her to me when she will come." The young man nodded, eager, and left. Maigret leaned back in his chair, smoke drifting upward, and closed his eyes. His wife's remark returned to him. An envelope without an address is meant for a hand, not the post. A shirt gone from a dead man's bag. A girl with a key she should not have. The powdered woman buying gloves she did not need. The plain woman asking for a letter that did not exist. And a man with a limp watching from the shadows. These were not fragments scattered at random. They were edges of a picture, slowly closing in. Toward evening, the young inspector returned, cheeks flushed with damp and effort. "We found her," he reported. "Leah. She was at a cafe near Bastille with friends. She came willingly when we spoke of you." A moment later she entered, small and nervous, her coat too thin for the weather. Her hair was damp, and she held her bag close to her chest as if it were a shield. She looked at Maigret with defiance, born of fear. "You have a key," he said at once, without preamble. "For a room you should not have." Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "I found it," she said, "in the corridor." He shook his head slowly, pipe between his teeth. "It was made. Cut for you." "Who gave it?" She pressed her lips together, eyes darting to the young inspector, then back to Maigret. He said nothing further, only leaned back in his chair, smoke curling, the silence heavy as a stone. After a long moment she burst out, "It was the gentleman with the limp. He paid me. He said only to fetch what was left, that it was his, that no one else must see what was left." She hesitated, clutching her bag tighter. "A shirt," she whispered. "He wanted a shirt. He said it would be marked, that inside the cuff there was something written. I didn't look, and the envelope." She shook her head fiercely. "I never saw an envelope. Only the shirt. He said if I found it, he would give me more money." Maigret studied her in silence. She was young, too young for secrets that might break her. She shifted under his gaze, twisting the bag until the clasp nearly snapped. He sighed, heavy, and rose. "Go home," he said. "Work for Madame Chevrier, if she will have you. Stay away from men who limp." She blinked at him, astonished, then nodded quickly and fled. The young inspector began to protest, but Maigret waved him away. "She knows nothing more. If she did, she would have already sold it." When the office was quiet again, he filled his pipe anew and lit it, drawing deep. A shirt with writing in the cuff. A watch missing from a wrist. An envelope vanished. He did not yet know what bound them, but he knew the thread was tightening around the man with the limp. That night at home, he sat in his armchair while Madame Maigret darned a sock by the lamplight. She asked nothing, but once she looked up and said, "When people steal shirts, it is because paper hides better in cloth than in drawers." He gave a grunt of agreement, smoke curling upward. Outside, the rain began again, tapping softly on the windows like fingers seeking entry. Somewhere in Paris, a man limped down a street, carrying with him a shirt torn from the bag of the dead. And Maigret, patient as stone, waited for the moment when the quiet walls would speak. The next morning, the air hung heavy, a damp stillness before more rain. Paris moved quietly, carts rolling with muffled wheels over wet stones, and the river lay dark and swollen beneath its bridges. Maigret stood by the window of his office, pipe in hand, watching the mist lift in slow tatters. He had slept little, not because of urgency, there was none, but because his mind circled the details as if the city itself whispered them through the walls. A shirt gone from a dead man's bag. A limp traced across a square. Powdered hands folded too tight in new gloves. A girl carrying a key she should not have, her fear already bought cheap. He turned from the window and lowered himself into his chair. The file of missing men lay where he had left it. He opened it again, this time reading with a slower patience. The commercial traveler from Rouen. Gone 3 days, last seen boarding a train with samples. The bank clerk from Montreux. Absent since Monday, his employer puzzled but not alarmed. Neither description fit perfectly, yet both were close. He closed the folder. Whoever the man had been, he had chosen to be without an address. It was the living who gave him names, and those names would betray themselves soon enough. By mid-morning, the inspector he had set to watch, Place des Vosges, entered with a note of movement. The powdered woman had left her building, veiled this time, and taken a taxi. She had not gone to Rue de Rivoli or the pension, but to a café near the Gare de Lyon. There she met the man with the limp. They spoke briefly, then left in different directions. The inspector had followed the man, who had gone into a small workshop on Rue Traversière, a place that smelled of oil and iron. He had stayed there. The inspector had waited, then left him still inside. Maigret nodded, tamping his pipe with a thick thumb. "You will go again," he said quietly, "but not too near. The air around him must grow heavy before he notices us. Heavy air makes men careless." The inspector nodded, puzzled but obedient. When he was gone, Maigret sat smoking, watching the smoke curl upward and vanish. A workshop smelling of oil, a watch missing from a wrist, a shirt with writing in its cuff. The threads drew closer. He felt them in his chest the way one feels the change of weather. By noon he was again in Rue de Turenne. The pension smelled of boiled cabbage and wet coats, the ordinary perfume of such places, but beneath it lay a sharper note. Unease. The student, Bernard, had gone. Madame Chevrier told him so with a mixture of relief and resentment, as though losing tenants was both blessing and curse. Madame Roussel remained, sewing behind her door, the thread flashing in and out like breath. The maid had not returned. "They all want to leave," Madame Chevrier said, twisting her apron. "They say the house is unlucky. They ask who the man was, and I cannot answer. When I clean, I hear my own steps and think they are his." Maigret listened without comment. He poured himself a cup of the coffee that stood always on the stove, black and thick, and drank it slowly. He asked no new questions. The house had given what it could, voices in the night, footsteps that did not belong, the smell of a stranger's tobacco. He let the silence fill the hallway until even Madame Chevrier seemed to breathe quieter, then left. That afternoon he walked toward Rue Traversière. The workshop was small, a narrow door with a flaking sign above it. Horlogerie, reparation. Inside, the air was indeed thick with oil, brass filings, and the slow tick of clocks that filled every corner. Behind a counter cluttered with watch cases stood the man with the limp. He looked up, eyes narrowing slightly, then masked the look with a smile that did not reach his face. His limp was less obvious when he stood still, but his left shoulder sagged as if compensating. "You repair watches," Maigret said, not as a question but a statement of air. "I do, monsieur. Old or new, all kinds." His voice was flat, neither welcoming nor hostile. Maigret nodded, setting his pipe between his teeth, though he did not light it. "And you keep one for yourself?" The man hesitated just a fraction too long before he raised his wrist. The watch there was cheap, nickel, the kind sold by the dozen in markets. Its strap was worn, but not with years of use, rather with hurried polishing. "Reliable enough," he said. Magrat's eyes moved to the benches crowded with tools, springs, dials. The clutter of a trade both exact and secretive. He let his gaze linger on a tray of cases, some empty, some full, and then on a scrap of cloth that lay folded on the corner of a stool. Plain cotton, collar frayed. He did not touch it. "I had one once," Maigret said, his tone almost conversational. "A gift. Brass. The strap wore through. It kept better time than most men." He drew deeply on the empty pipe, exhaling only silence. "Perhaps I'll bring it here one day." The man inclined his head. "I would be honored." Maigret nodded, turned and left, his heavy steps echoing on the pavement outside. He did not look back. That evening he returned home earlier than usual. Madame Maigret had laid the table with care, as though sensing he might need steadiness. They ate in silence, the simple meal of boiled beef and carrots filling the room with its plain comfort. Afterward he sat in his chair with a glass of beer, pipe lit at last, and she took up her sewing. For a long time only the ticking of the clock marked the hours. Then she said quietly, "Men who repair watches know how to stop them too." He looked at her, his eyes heavy but not surprised. He nodded once, drew on his pipe, and let the thought settle like ash. The next morning he returned to the quay. The inspector with the mustache awaited him, nervous. "The girl," he reported. "Leah. She has disappeared. Her mother swears she left for work yesterday and never returned. No friends have seen her." Maigret said nothing at first. He sat down, drew smoke, and stared at the grey window. At last he said, "She is with them now. The powdered woman, the man with the limp, perhaps the plain one too. Secrets gather people like damp gathers dust." He stood, put on his coat, and left again for Rue Traversière. The workshop was shuttered, the clocks inside stilled. The street smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. He stood before the closed door, pipe smoke drifting into the mist, and felt the story pressing harder against its seams. The man, without an address, had left behind a shirt, a watch, an envelope. Others had taken them, but they had not yet hidden themselves well enough. Already their silence rattled like a loose spring. He turned away at last, walking slowly toward the river. The air was heavy, thick with rain not yet fallen, and in it he felt the weight of the truth waiting, inevitable, ready to break open like the clouds above Paris. The morning after the shuttered workshop, the river lay like a strip of pewter under a low sky, and the streets had that washed look Paris wears when it has been thinking too hard. Maigret walked to the quay with his hat pulled down and his pipe unlit, feeling the weight of the day settle on his shoulders the way a shawl settles on an old woman's back. In his office, the radiator ticked like an old clock and the window pane held a flat, indifferent light. He hung his coat, sat, and let the first match flare in the cupped cave of his hands. The pipe bloomed, thick and blue, and for a minute he watched the smoke go up as if it were a message that could be read if one were patient enough. Lognon came in without making it a visit. He stood in the doorway, damp as a dog, and twice as resigned. "Your man in Rue de Touraine," he said, as if the name itself were an accusation. Pathology notes, incomplete combustion, a draft at the window. Accident. There's enough work already without fishing in basins for carp that have died of their own accord. Carp get fished whether they asked for it or not, Maigret said mildly. He did not look at Lognon. He watched the grey outside. If you pass a hat and glove shop on Rue de Rivoli with nothing to do, ask the proprietress how long she thinks veils last before they tangle. "You think I have nothing to do," Lognon muttered, and then, because he could never quite help himself, "Which shop?" "You'll see it when you see it," said Maigret, and the conversation ended, as most with Lognon did, with a little private sigh. When the door closed, he rang downstairs and asked for 2 coffees to be sent up. He did not need 2. Habit sometimes calls for a second cup so the first doesn't feel lonely. While he waited, he wrote on a scrap of paper a few words that were not for any file. Powder, limp, gum, shirt, guerre. He underlined the last word without meaning to. The inspector's report had said the powdered woman met the limping man near the Gare de Lyon, and they had sat together long enough to cross a small bridge of silence. Workshops, watches, trains. The words seemed to know one another already. When the coffee came, he poured both into a cracked mug and drank, then picked up the telephone and told the desk sergeant that if a visitor asked for him, tall, carefully powdered, pearl-grey gloves, she was to be sent up and given a moment at the stove before being asked any questions. He did not say if she comes, be kind to her. He had learned long ago that kindness is something men do either naturally or not at all. Orders spoil it. She came an hour later. The veil she had not bought now lay against her face like the shadow of a net. She removed her gloves with that small precision of women who have had to make small things last. She looked at the room as if it had been described to her, and then at him, as if she had not expected the size of him. He gestured to the chair near the radiator. "You told me yesterday," he said, "that when you were ready, you would come where there was a stove and coffee." She sat without yielding to the chair. "I am here," she said. The voice was smoother than the rest of her. He poured coffee and set it near her hand. She did not touch it. "You have been to Rue de Turenne more than once," he went on. "You went at night. You said you had lost a glove. You found nothing you could use. The concierge would not help me." "She helps people who help her house," said Maigret. "It is a small difference that changes everything." He filled his pipe again without lighting it. "I won't ask you your name. Names are the last things we need. When we have everything else, the names choose themselves." Her hands lay flat on her skirt, palms down, as if to hold something in place beneath. The veil made her eyes a little hazy, but did nothing to the line of her mouth, which was a line men make when they intend to keep standing. "He is dead," she said simply. "He is," said Maigret, "and you will find who killed him." "I might," he said. "Or perhaps no one killed him. Perhaps he killed himself without meaning to by being tired and foolish. But it was not the gas that brought you to a lodging-house twice, nor the gas that brought you to the bench at the Place des Vosges, nor the gas that followed you to the Gare de Lyon. Gas doesn't cost as much as new gloves." Her eyes flicked, the smallest movement of a bird in a hedge. "You are unkind," she murmured. "I'm a man who has watched stoves and people for a long time," he said, "and I have an old woman's habit of noticing what is under fingernails." He nodded toward the cup. "Drink. It will be cold soon." She lifted it and drank, and a soft shudder went through the veil. A small animal's tremor passed off as chill. "I did not kill him," she said. "I did not tell him to die." "You told him to come," said Maigret. She stared at the cup and saw what people see there when they would like to see nothing. "He came of his own accord." He always did. He had that goodness in him that makes a man ridiculous and necessary at the same time. A breath, a tiny, bitter laugh. I preferred him when he was ridiculous. "He worked with money," said Maigret. "He did not have any." "Because he had a wife," she said, and now the bitterness turned toward herself. "Because he had a wife and a job and a life that smelled like clean paper. He would bring me little things, you know, not flowers. Receipts. He would put them on the table as if they were gifts. He would cough and smile and say that this proved the world held together because men wrote down that it did." "And you?" asked Maigret. She adjusted the veil, though it did not need it. "I had debts. Not large ones. Never large, enough to matter to anyone important. Only the kind that makes people talk in stairwells. The rent after the rent. The little things that have the indecency to cost. Gloves, veils, courage, and the man with the limp. She made a small face, as if something tasted of iron. "He is no one," she said. "No one," repeated Maigret, as if trying the sound for himself. "No one has a workshop where watches are taught to pretend they run. No one stands under an arch and counts the steps in a square. No one pays a maid for a key and asks her to fetch a shirt out of a dead man's bag. No one meets in a cafe where the trains are named for places other people go." She lowered her head. The veil brushed the rim of the cup. For a long time there was only the breath of the radiator and the sound of the river beyond the window. When she spoke, it was to the coffee. "He is called Vidal," she said. "He lives above a workshop that belongs to his cousin, perhaps. He makes nothing. He repairs what is already broken. He has friends who are not friendly. He told me he could make my small troubles smaller. He made them larger. That is his trade. And the dead man made them smaller. For a time," she lifted her head, "you have guessed already who he was. You knew before I came up the stairs. You have that kindness, to know and to wait for someone else to say it." Maigret did not answer. He waited. "He was the clerk from Montreuil," she said, and the words dropped into the room without any splash at all. "Not a thief. Not yet. He had not stolen anything. He had signed papers that said he would. He had signed them for me." She pressed her lips together and made herself look at him. He brought an envelope. It was not addressed because it was not for the post. It was for a hand. Mine. He said I must not open it until— She stopped. He said until the number on the cuff. Maigret sat very still. Only his thumb moved on the cold pipe bowl. The cuff. He wrote numbers on the inside of his shirts when he was nervous. He always had. I told him it made him look poor. He laughed. He said clothes are for wearing and that paper tears and hands forget. The number would not forget. She swallowed. He was going to write it again, the night he died. He coughed. He said he would open the window first. He had those foolish habits of men who live in small rooms. "And you left?" "I left," she said. "He did not want me to see him write." He was shy about his little tricks. I went down the stairs and sat on the step in the courtyard and cried because he was ridiculous and because he was good and because I had no courage left. Vidal came. He had followed me. He followed everyone. "And after the man died," said Maigret gently, "Vidal wanted the shirt, because the number would be in the cuff, and the envelope would make sense." She nodded once. The veil lifted and fell with the movement. He sent the girl. He told her she was pretty. He told her she could keep a glove. He told her everyone lies to policemen, but no one lies to him. He told me that too, the envelope, said Maigret. "I never had it," she said. "I swear, when I went back in the morning, it was gone. I told him it was gone. He did not believe me. He never believes women when they say something is empty." Her voice grew very small. "He slapped me in the corridor." The seamstress heard. I was ashamed. "Not of him," said Maigret. "Of needing such men," she said simply. "Of arranging my face in the morning so that the concierge would let me be sad in her hallway." A thread of anger, so thin it was almost grace, ran through the last words. It died as quickly as it had come. "If I had the envelope now, I'd give it to you. I would even ask you to be kind to me afterward. But I do not. I have only the number. I think I have it. I think I remember." She pressed her hands together as if warming them. 417. He said it twice when he coughed, or I made it so. One makes numbers after men die. It gives death something to count. 417, repeated Maigret, and the pipe between his teeth moved a fraction. "Consigne," he said, as though talking to the window. "Left luggage at the Gare de Lyon." Her eyes flinched. "Perhaps He liked trains, you know. He liked the idea that one could leave without an address and still arrive somewhere honest. He kept tickets in his pocket to make himself feel brave. He kept his watch on a chain even when chains were out of fashion. He said it made time behave, and his watch, said Maigret. She shook her head. I did not take it. Vidal did. He laughed and said men who count other people's money do not need to know what hour it is. He rose, not quickly. Big men do nothing quickly if they can avoid it. He went to the window and watched the square blur in the damp. He let the silence expand until it touched all four walls. Then he turned back to her. You will go home, he said, and you will not leave your door for anyone who smells of oil. If Vidal comes, you will tell him there are policemen in the stairwell who smoke too much and cannot be moved. You will say it lightly. You will say it as if it amuses you. It will not amuse him. That is the point and the girl. If Vidal keeps her, he keeps his own misfortune. He's like a man who hides a ticking clock under a cushion. He sleeps worse and worse and does not know why. He picked up the telephone and asked for a number he knew at the Gare de Lyon, a man who had been a guard before he had been given a desk. When the voice came on, Maigret said only, if a man with a limp and a woman with a veil come asking for a parcel from Consigne 417, give them coffee. Give them too much coffee. And then call me. He hung up and met the woman's eyes. Do you remember anything else? She shook her head, then stopped and nodded at once, as if correcting herself from one life to the other. He always said, when he was happy, rarely, that names don't matter when your pockets are full of little papers with other people's names on them. He said it as if it were a joke, and then looked ashamed. She rose, gathering herself. If you find the envelope, will you let it say what it wanted to say, just once, before you make it say the thing it has to? I'm an old man, said Maigret. I let things speak. Sometimes longer than I should. He walked her to the door. She put on her gloves, too carefully for the hour, and went out like a person who has decided to keep standing for one more day. When the corridor had eaten her footsteps, he sat again and did nothing that could be written down. He smoked. He thought about shirt cuffs and men who write on cloth because paper betrays them, and about left luggage counters that keep other people's courage in neat metal boxes. He thought about a watchmaker who did not make watches and about girls who believe slaps settle debts. He thought about a clerk who liked trains because their timetables were a kind of honesty and who had opened a window before writing numbers he had no right to write. He waited. The river moved. Somewhere in the station, a bell rang the way bells ring when not much is expected to happen. He did not smile. He only watched the smoke go up, and when the telephone finally rang, he reached for it without hurry, as a man reaches for a hat he wears every day. The telephone call had come from the Gare de Lyon. The guard's voice lowered as if the walls of the consigne had ears. 417, Chief. They were here. The man with the limp and the lady, veiled. They asked. I gave them coffee, as you said. Too much coffee. They sit now and do not know whether to leave or stay. Maigret put on his coat slowly, the way a man dresses for rain he knows will not stop. He crossed the river in the late afternoon light, the drizzle falling like dust shaken from a cloth. At the station, the hall smelled of damp wool, metal, and travel. The clatter of departures echoed against the high glass roof. He walked heavily to the consignee. They were there as described. Vidal hunched over his cup, his limp hidden for the moment by the chair. The woman upright, veil still in place, her hands folded as if she were still trying to keep them from trembling. He did not hurry them. He ordered his own coffee, lit his pipe, and sat opposite, filling the air with smoke. They looked at him as people look at rain clouds, inevitable, wearying, something that will not be moved by complaint. You've come for the parcel, he said at last. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Number 417. He left it for you and you've made it a hunt. The shirt, the envelope, the watch. They were only keys to this. To a box in a station, waiting to be opened, Vidal shifted. his jaw working. "It was mine," he muttered. "He owed me." "He owed no one but himself," said Maigret. "He was a clerk who signed papers he should not have, for a woman who wanted to be brave and found she could not. He wrote numbers in the cuff of his shirt because he trusted cloth more than paper. He hid an envelope without an address because he thought one day it would be safer to give than to keep. And you," Maigret's eyes moved to Vidal, "you smelled money the way other men smell gas. You followed him, you followed her, you followed even the maid with her foolish key. But what you followed was his shame. And shame is not currency." Vidal made a movement as if to rise, but the limp betrayed him, pulling him back down. The woman's eyes, behind the veil, were wet now, though her mouth stayed hard. "What was in it?" she whispered. "The envelope?" Maigret took his time, drawing on his pipe. It held the numbers of accounts, nothing more. Little sums, balances on ledgers, enough to suggest he had taken what he had not yet taken. He was a man caught between wanting to help you and fearing to harm himself. He wrote the numbers to prove he could. He sealed them in an envelope without a name because he could not yet decide whose hands should burn with them. She lowered her head. "So he died for nothing?" "No," Maigret said, and his tone softened. "He died as men like him die. Timid, decent, foolish, loving. The gas was an accident, but it was also a choice. He opened the window, then the stove, then coughed and forgot himself. Perhaps he was tired of waiting for one of you to decide what to do with him. Perhaps he wanted to leave without an address, as he had lived." The guard returned with a small parcel, metal tag clinking. Maigret took it, weighed it in his palm, and did not open it. He set it on the table between them. "This is what you've chased," he said. "This box is heavier in your thoughts than it will ever be in your hands." "Do you want it?" Vidal stared at it, eyes narrowing, greed and fear wrestling in his face. The woman kept her hands folded, not reaching. Finally, Maigret took the parcel back, handed it to the guard, and said, "It belongs to the magistrate now. Let him decide what numbers mean. The rest," he looked at the woman, then at Vidal, "will remain with you." There was no arrest then, no scene. Vidal sagged into his chair, beaten not by evidence, but by the simple truth of his own hunger. The woman sat straighter, veil trembling, as if at last she could stop pretending. Maigret rose, put on his hat, and left them with their coffee gone cold. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into a steady rain. He walked slowly across the square, pipe glowing, coat darkening at the shoulders. Paris moved around him, indifferent, alive with the sound of carts and footsteps and bells. At a cafe near the river he stopped, ordered a glass of beer, and stood under the arbour's awning, watching the water run in silver threads down the street. The case was finished, though nothing was resolved in a way that could be written neatly. A man without an address had died in a small room, leaving behind not riches or crimes, but a tangle of shame, love, and small deceits. Others had circled him like moths, desperate to claim or conceal what he had left. In the end, there was nothing to claim, only the knowledge of what they had done to him and to themselves. Maigret drank his beer slowly, the rain pattering on the awning above, and thought of the dead man's hands, clean, ordinary, calloused long ago. He thought of his wife's words at breakfast, powder for courage, an envelope for a hand. He thought of the pension on Rue de Turenne, its smell of cabbage and gas, its rooms that remembered too much. When the glass was empty, he set it down, pulled his coat tighter, and walked on. The river ran dark beneath the bridges. The city steamed in the rain, and Maigret, weary but calm, let it all pass through him as he made his way home, where the stove would be warm and supper waiting. He would not speak of the case. He would sit with his wife, smoke his pipe, and listen to the quiet. And Paris, vast and indifferent, would already be hiding another story behind another door, 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 behind another door.